Daf Yomi, Tractate Avodah Zarah, page Mem Gimel, 43, starting at the bottom of 42b. With the Gemara, when the Gemara is asking if it's referring to a case where one forms a figure, lest the last clause of Sheshet's statement, all figures are permitted, except for the figure of a dragon. And this is talking about figures of idols and what one can derive benefit from it or not. So it was said that the figure of a dragon is forbidden to derive any benefit, and if is referring to a case where one forms a figure, is forming the figure of a dragon prohibited? But isn't it written, "You shall not make with me gods of silver or gods of gold"? So maybe it's not prohibited. I'm not sure what they were saying by that. They were trying to imply that it's talking about a figure of a dragon, and that's prohibited. And then they were asking, it's written that you should not make gods of gold or silver. It's hard to say whether they're connecting that to a dragon or not. Is it a dragon of gold or what they're referring to? But in any case, we're turning to 43a, top of the page. Hani in Suazrakando. The sage interprets this verse as referring to the heavenly constellations, which indicates that it is prohibited to form only these figures, but it is not prohibited to form a dragon. Okay, so I think that what they mean is that when it says don't make gods of silver and gold, that you shouldn't make, but a dragon doesn't say that, so that you could. Obviously, if it was a dragon of gold, you couldn't do it because it's gold, but I think that's what they're saying here. Rather, the Gemara concludes it is obvious that this halakha is referring to a case where one finds a vessel with the figure of a dragon, and this is, as we learned in the Mishnah, in the case of one who finds vessels, and upon them is a figure of the sun, a figure of the moon, or a figure of a dragon, he must take them and cast them into the Dead Sea. The Gemara asks about the lack of consistency between the clauses of Sheshet's statement. Can it be that the first clause and the last clause are referring to a case where one finds vessels with the specified figures, and the middle clause is referring to a case where one forms these figures? Abaye said, indeed, the first clause and the last clause are referring to cases where one finds vessels with figures, and the middle clause is referring to a case where one forms figures. Rava Amar, Kula b'moitza mitziyasa Yehudai, Titania, Rav Yehuda Moisif, Aftemus, Menika v'Sar Apis. Meniko al Shem Chava, Shemenika kol oelim kula, Sar Apis al Shem Yosef, Shesama Amepis al kol ha'olam kulo, Ve'odin agad griva v'kar ha'el, Ve'ahi dinakta ben v'kar menika. Rava said the entire statement of Rav Sheshet is referring to a case where one finds vessels with these figures, and the middle clause is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda, as it is taught in a Braita that Rabbi Yehuda adds to the list of forbidden figures even a figure of a nursing woman and Sar Apis. The figure of a nursing woman is worshipped as it symbolizes Eve, who nurses the entire world. The figure of Sar Apis is worshipped as it symbolizes Joseph, who ruled over and appeased the entire world by distributing food during the 7 years of famine. See Genesis 41. But the figure of Zarah is forbidden only when it is holding a dry measure and measuring with it. And the figure of a nursing woman is forbidden only when she is holding a child and nursing. How can it be a figure of a nursing woman and she's not holding a child? Anyway, Tanu Rabbanan Ezu Tzuras Drakon Peresh Rabbi Shimon Elazar כל שיש לו ציצין בין פרקיו מחווה רבי יאסי בין פרקי צוואר אמר רבי חמא ורבי חנינא חנוך רבי שמעון בן אלעזר. The sages taught, what is the figure of a dragon? Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar explained, it is any figure that has scales between its joints. Rabbi Yassi motioned with his hands to depict scales between the joints of the neck. Rabbi Chama, the son of Rabbi Hanina, says the halacha is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar. Amar Rabbi Bar Chana, Amar Yehoshua ben Levi. פעם אחת הייתי מהלך אחרי רבי אלעזר הכפר ברבי דרה בדרך ומצא שם טבעת ועליה צורת דרקון ומצא גוי קטן ולא אמר לו כלום. מצא גוי גדול ואמר לו בטלה ולא ביטלה, סתרו ביטלה. Rabbi Bar Chana says that Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi says, once I was following Rabbi Elazar HaKapar, the distinguished, on the road, and he found a ring there, and there was a figure of a dragon on it. And he then encountered a minor Gentile boy, but did not say anything to him. And then he encountered an adult Gentile and said to him, revoke that ring's idolatrous status. The Gentile did not revoke it. Rabbi Elazar HaKapar then slapped him across his face, whereupon the Gentile succumbed and revoked its idolatrous status. Shma minat la Shma minat goy bivatu lo mizare Shelo yibshachem Shma minat yodea batif Shema yizar meshmeh batel She'en batif yizar meshmeh batel Shma minat goy bivatu bal kol choy. The Gemara comments, learn from this incident the following to be halachot. Learn from it that a Gentile can revoke the adulterous status of both his object of idol worship and that of another Gentile. And learn from it the fact that Rabbi Elazar HaKapar waited to find an adult Gentile, that only one who is aware of the nature of idol worship and its accessories can revoke the idol status. But one who is not aware of the nature of idol worship and its accessories, such as a minor, cannot revoke the idol's status. And finally, learn from it that a Gentile can revoke the status of an idol, even against his own will. Megadev bar Rabbi Chanina velet le Rabbi Elazar HaKapar ברבי הדתנן המציל מן הארי ומן הדוב ומן הנמר ומן הגייס ומן הנהר מזאתו של ים ומשלוניתו של נהר ומוצא בסעתיה פלטיה גדולה ובכל מקום שהרבים מצוין שם, הרי אלו שלו, מפני שהבעלים מתייאשים מהם. Rabbi Hanina ridiculed this ruling and asked, but why was it necessary to have a Gentile actively revoke the idolatrous status of the ring? Doesn't Rabbi Elazar HaKapar, the distinguished, maintain, in accordance with that which we learned in a Braita? In the case of one who saves an object from a lion, or from a bear, or from a cheetah, or from a troop of soldiers, or from a river, or from the tide of the sea, or from the flooding of a river, Or similarly, one who finds an object in a main thoroughfare or in a large plaza, or for that matter, anywhere frequented by the public. In all these cases, the objects belong to him, because the owners despair of recovering them. Therefore, in the case of the lost ring, with an idolatrous figure on it, its idolatrous status is automatically revoked, as its owner despairs of recovering it. Abaye said, granted, the owner despairs of recovering the object itself, but does he despair of its forbidden idolatrous status? The owner does not assume that the object will never be worshipped again. Rather, he says to himself, if a Gentile finds it, he will worship it. If a Jew finds it, since it is valuable, he will sell it to a Gentile, who will then worship it. Therefore, Rabbi Elazar ben Akapar had to have the ring's idolatrous status revoked. Tanan hadam dimutsu adevanot. Hayarola be'yato v'tavna bekotel. Shemehen maretet yotot. Omar lahen kazer item o kazer item. We learned in the Mishnah there, in Rosh Hashanah 24a. Rabban Gamliel had diagrams of the different figures of moons. I remember this. Different figures of moons drawn on a tablet that hung on the wall of his attic, which he would show the ordinary people who came to testify about the sighting of the new moon, but who were unable to adequately describe what they had seen. And he would say to them, did you see an image like this, or did you see an image like that? Rubi Shari Yachitiv Lo Tasuniti Lo Tasun Kidemut Shamshai Amshamshim Befanai. The Gemara asks, and is it permitted to form these figures? But isn't it written, you shall not make with me gods, silver, gods of gold, Exodus 20:20, which is interpreted to mean, you shall not make figures of my attendants who serve before me, meaning those celestial bodies that were created to serve God, including the sun and the moon. Abaye, lo asotoy shavashim shelasos kimotah. In answering, Abaye said the Torah prohibited only the figures of those attendants that one can possibly reproduce something that is truly in their likeness. Since it is impossible to reproduce the sun and the moon, the prohibition does not apply to these entities. Kiritanya lo yaseh adam bet tavnit techan ach sadra tavnit ulam chatzar tavnit azareh shulchan tavnit shulchan v'noira tavnit b'noira אבל הוא עושה של 5 ושל 6 ושל 8 ושל 7 לא יעשה אפילו שאר מיני מתחייז. As it is taught in Brighton, a person may not construct a house in the exact image of the sanctuary, nor a portico in the exact image of the entrance hall of the sanctuary, nor a courtyard corresponding to the temple courtyard, nor a table corresponding to the table in the temple, nor a candelabrum corresponding to the candelabrum in the temple. But one may fashion a candelabrum of 5 or 6 or of 8 lamps. And one may not fashion a candelabrum of 7 lamps, even if he constructs it from other kinds of metal rather than gold, as in extending circumstances the candelabrum of the temple may be fashioned from other metals. Rabbi Yossi bar Yehuda Omer Ashiyesh Eitz lo yaseh kederech yasu bet chashmonai. The Brisa continues. Rabbi Yossi bar Yehuda says, one may not fashion a candelabrum of wood either, in the manner that the kings of the Hasmonean monarchy fashioned it. When they first purified the temple, they had to fashion the candelabrum out of wood. as no other material is available, since a wood candelabrum is fit for the temple, it is prohibited to fashion one of this kind for oneself. Amrullah Mishamraya Shipudin Shilpazel Hayu Khofin, then parentheses it says V'chipum Va'atz Heshiru Asab Shakesif Kazu Heshiru Asab Shazav. The rabbi said to Rabbi Yossi Bar Yehuda, do you seek to cite proof from there, meaning from the Hasmonean era, that a candelabrum fashion of wood is fit for the temple? During that era, the branches of the candelabrum were fashioned from spits of iron, and they covered them with tin. Later, when they grew richer and could afford a candelabrum of higher quality material, they fashioned the candelabrum from silver. When they grew even richer, they fashioned the candelabrum from gold. In any event, Abaye proves from this Braita that the prohibition against forming a figure applies only to items that can be found reconstructed in an accurate manner. Since this is not possible in the case of the moon, Rabban Gamliel's figures were permitted. V'shamashin she'iev sherasais kamoisim mishari v'atanya lo tasun iti lo tasun gidmut shamashai ameshamshim lifanai b'maram. The Gemara asks, and is it actually permitted to fashion figures of those attendants of God concerning which it is impossible to reproduce their likeness? But isn't it taught in Braita that the verse "You shall not make with me gods of silver," Exodus 20:20, etc., is interpreted to mean you shall not make figures of my attendants who serve before me on high? Apparently, this includes the sun and the moon. Abaye said, and now we turn to Mem Gimel, Amid Beis, 43b. Top of the page, with the words Lo Asatoya Ela B'dmut Zarah Panim Hadadi. This does not include the sun, the moon, as the Torah prohibits the fashioning only of a figure of all four faces of the creatures of the divine chariot together. See Ezekiel 1:10, and all other figures which are not in the likeness of the ministering angels are permitted. Weiter. Okay, we're turning on to the top of 43b. Abaye said, now 43b, the top of 43b is Lo Asra Torah. This does not include the sun and the moon, as the Torah prohibits the fashioning only a figure of all four faces of the creatures of the divine chariot together. We see Ezekiel 1:10, and all other figures which are not in the likeness of the ministering angels are permitted. The Gemara raises difficulty. If that is so, let the fashioning of a figure of a human face alone be permitted. Why then is it taught in a Braita figures of all faces are permitted except for the human face? Amar Yehoshua Bipirkei Rav Yehoshua Shmi alei lo tasun iti lo tasun oti avashal shamashin shari. Rav Yehuda, the son of Rav Yehoshua, said, I heard in a lecture of Rav Yehoshua that there is a different reason why one may not fashion a figure of a human face. The verse states, you shall not make with me, E.T., Exodus 20:20. This can be read as, you shall not make me. Since the human being was created in the image of God, see Genesis 1:27, it is prohibited to fashion an image of a human being, but fashioning figures of other attendants of God is permitted. Gemara asks, is it really actually permitted to fashion figures of other attendants of God? V'atanya lo tasun iti lo tasun kimu shemoshe b'shamshin lefanim b'marim The Gemara asks, and is it permitted to fashion figures of other attendants to God? But isn't it taught in another Braita that the verse, "You shall not make with me gods of silver," Exodus 20:20, is interpreted to mean that you shall not make figures of my attendants who serve before me on high. For example, Ophanim and Seraphim and sacred Chayot and the ministering angels. Abaye said, the Torah prohibits fashioning figures of only those attendants that are in the upper heaven, meaning the supreme angels in the highest firmament, but it does not prohibit fashioning the celestial bodies, for example the sun and the moon, despite the fact that they too are located in heaven, at least one part of heaven. V'shema sheb mador tachta mishari v'tanya asher b'shemayim l'rabot chama l'vanach kochavim u'mazalot bima l'rabot l'vanisharis. The Gemara asks, and is it permitted to fashion figures of those bodies that are in the lower heaven? But isn't it taught in a Braita with regard to the verse, "You shall not make for yourself any graven image, nor any manner or likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth." Exodus 20, verse 4. The phrase "that is in the heaven" serves to include the sun, the moon, the stars, and the constellations. The term above serves to include the ministering angels. Apparently, it is prohibited to fashion a figure even of the celestial bodies that are in the lower heaven. Ki Tanya Avodah. The Gemara answers, when that Braita is taught is in reference to the prohibition against worshiping them. There is no prohibition against forming a figure in their eyes. Shilshul Katanami. The Gemara asked if that Braita is referring to the prohibition against worshiping them, then why does it mention only celestial bodies? It is prohibited to worship even a tiny worm. The Gemara answers, yes, it is indeed so, and this projection is derived from the later clause of the verse, as is taught in Braita, that is in his youth. Serves to include seas and rivers and mountains and hills. The word beneath serves to include a tiny word beneath serves to include a tiny worm. A tiny worm. Die. A tiny worm serves to include even a tiny worm. The Gemara asks, and is the mere fashioning of figures of celestial bodies permitted? But isn't it taught in another Braita that the verse, "You shall not make with me gods of silver," Exodus 20:20, is interpreted to mean that you shall not make figures of my attendants who serve before me on high, for example, the sun, the moon, the stars, and the constellations? This is proof that it is prohibited to fashion figures of the sun and the moon. Consequently, the solution proposed by Abaye is rejected, leaving the difficulty of Rabban Gamliel's diagram unresolved. The Gemara purposes an alternative resolution. The case of Rabban Gamliel is different, as others, meaning Gentiles, fashion those for him, and it is prohibited for a Jew only to fashion such figures. There's no prohibition against having them in one's possession. Okay, makes sense. Vital. The Har of Yehuda, in the case of Yehuda, where others fashioned form a seal with a figure of a person on it, and Shmuel said to Yehuda, who was a sharp-witted one, destroy this one's eyes, disfigure it, as is prohibited to have even a figure of one human being in one's possession. Okay, so let's go back one more line. The question was, how was Rabbi Gamliel allowed to have these? So it says the Gemara purpose Shani Rabbi Gamliel Dacher Masul. The Gemara said that others made it for him. So then the Gemara asked, but in the case of Yehuda, others made it for him, a seal with a figure of a person on it. Shmuel said you can't even have that in your possession. So who cares that someone else made it? You're not allowed to have it. Okay, Hasum Chot Mabolet Mishum Chashada Detanya. טבעת שחותמה בולט, אסור להניחה, מותר לחתום בה. חתמה, שוקע, מותר להניחה, אסור לחתום בה. The Gemara answers there in the case of Rabbi Yehuda, his was a protruding seal, meaning a figure projected from the ring, and Shmuel prohibited due to the potential suspicion that he had an object of idol worship in his possession, as is taught in the Brayta. In the case of a ring whose seal protrudes, it is prohibited to place it on one's finger due to suspicion of idol worship, but it is permitted to seal objects with it. In this case, the act of sealing forms a figure that is sunken below the surface of the object upon which the seal is impressed, which is not prohibited if its seal is sunken. It is permitted to place it on one's finger, but it is prohibited to seal object with it, as that forms a protruding figure. Umi chashinam lechashadam. V'habe knishta deshaf, yatev binarda'a, the okame, and in brackets it says the okimu, be'indrata, v'havo ayeli bet avud shmu v'levi matzilu v'gavim, v'lo chashi lechashad l'rabim shane. The Gemara asks, and we are concerned about arousing suspicion due to the figure. Are we concerned about arousing suspicion due to the use of a human figure? But what about that synagogue that had been destroyed in Eretz Israel and was reestablished in Avodah? And they erected a statue of the king in it. And nevertheless, Shmuel's father, Levi, would enter and pray in it. And they were not concerned about arousing suspicion. The more answers, the public institution is different. The public is not suspected of having idolatrous intentions. Rather, it is assumed that the statue is there exclusively for ornamental purposes. Okay. The Gemara asks, but wasn't Rabban Gamliel an individual? According to this reasoning, his figures of the moon should have been forbidden, as they would have aroused suspicion. The Gemara answers, since he was the Nasi, the head of the Sanhedrin, members of the public would often be found with him, and therefore there was no room for suspicion. And if you wish, say, there is an alternative answer, namely that these figures were not whole, rather they were formed from pieces of figures that had to be assembled. Only complete figures are forbidden. Ibayit ema lihitlamed shani detanya lo tilmad lasot. If you wish to say, there's yet another answer. Fashioning figures in order to teach oneself is different, as it is taught in a Brayta with regard to the verse, you shall not learn to do like the abominations of those nations, Deuteronomy 18:9. But you may learn in order to understand the matter yourself and teach it to others. In other words, it is permitted to perform certain acts for the sake of Torah that would otherwise be prohibited. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel Me'er Ezehen mechubadin, ezehen mebuzin. The Mishnah in 42b teaches that Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel says those figures that are upon respectable vessels are forbidden. Those that are upon disgraceful vessels are permitted. The Gemara asks, which vessels are considered respectable and which are considered disgraceful? Amara mechubadin l'man l'mayim mevuzin l'matuvin l'mayim u'shmon amar elu ve'elu mevuzin hein ve'elu ve'elu mechubadin she'al asherin Rav says these terms do not represent different types of vessels, but rather the location of the figure on the vessel. A respectable location for an idolatrous figure is on the side of the vessel above the level of the water or food contents. A disgraceful location is below the water level, and Shmuel says both these locations aren't eating utensils are disgraceful. Rather, these are respectable locations upon bracelets or upon rings or upon nose rings or upon rings. Okay. Tanya Kavasi Shmuel Mechuvadan Shal Asherin Bianazav Boys Mechuvadan Shal Yerois Biala Kumosin Biala Mechamer Chamim Chamim Ishal Hasadinin Ve'al HaMitpachot. The Gemara comments, it is taught in a priority in accordance with the opinion of Shmuel to specify one. Respectable locations for idolatrous figures are upon bracelets, or upon nose rings, or upon rings. Disgraceful locations are upon large pots, or upon small kettles, or upon samovars, or upon sheets, or upon towels. And that's it. New Mishnah. רבי יוסי אומר, שורק וזרע לרוח ומטיל לים, אמרו לו, אף הוא נעשה זבל שנאמר, לא ידבק בידך מאומה מן החרם. The Mishnah says that Rabbi Yossi says, when one encounters an idol, he should grind the idol and throw the dust to the wind or cast it into the sea. The rabbi said to him, what is the good of that? That also gives the Jew benefit from the idol as it becomes fertilizer for his crops. I never knew that stone was fertilizer, but okay. And deriving any kind of benefit is prohibited, as it is stated. And nothing of the prescribed items shall cleave to your hand. Deuteronomy 13:18. That's the whole Mishnah. Gemara. The Talmud says, Tanya Amar Lahem Yossi, Velo Kvanem Avet Chatatchem. The Gemara says it is taught in Braita, in Sefta 3:16. that Rabbi Yossi said to them, but isn't it already stated? And we'll leave it there for the next time.